In a small town nestled within the heart of Texas, life followed a steady, unhurried rhythm, a constant flow of predictable routines. The days bled into one another, and the nights were quiet, save for the occasional hum of distant traffic. It was a place where everyone knew everyone else's business, a town that prided itself on its close-knit community. The high school, standing proudly at the town center, was the cornerstone of this community, an institution where generations of families had sent their children to learn, grow, and eventually become a part of the same cycle. It was here that Emily Carter, at the age of 12, made her mark. Emily was a quiet girl, a shadow among her peers, always on the outside looking in. Her presence was felt, though, despite her silence. She had an intensity about her, a stillness that made people take notice. Her family had lived in the town for generations. Their name carried weight, their legacy steeped in old traditions and beliefs. Emily's father, a successful local businessman, was a staunch believer in the old ways. A man who clung tightly to the ideals of a past that seemed to have long since passed everyone by. His world was one of segregation, subtle but firm, and he made no secret of his disapproval of what he perceived as the changing face of the country. Emily's mother, though quieter and more reserved, never openly challenged her husband's views. Her silence, though passive, spoke volumes in its own way. At home, the atmosphere was thick with old beliefs. Ideas that, while no longer common in most places, still found fertile ground here. Emily's parents, in ways that were often imperceptible, made sure she understood who belonged and who did not. Black students were rarely invited into their home, their presence an anomaly rather than the norm. When Emily's father did speak of black people, it was with a quiet disdain, a whisper of a judgment that made it clear they were not to be trusted, not to be accepted as equals. Her mother's disapproving glances at the mere mention of anyone outside their racial group solidified the family's position on the matter. To Emily, these unspoken lessons were just part of the world. She absorbed them with the ease of a child who had no reason to question what was being taught. It wasn't overt racism that shaped her. No, it was far subtler than that. It was the quiet, creeping sort that seeped into the very fabric of her existence, passed down like a family heirloom. And Emily, being young and impressionable, took it all in without ever questioning it. The town itself, much like Emily's home, wasn't much different. The high school, though a place for learning, reflected the same undercurrent of division. It was a predominantly white institution, with only a handful of black students scattered across various grades. Jamal Reed, a bright 12-year-old boy, and Kayla Thompson, a shy 11-year-old girl, were among the few black students who attended. Both had dreams, aspirations like any other child. Jamal wanted to be an engineer, to create things that would change the world, while Kayla dreamed of becoming a doctor, someone who could heal and make a difference in people's lives. But these dreams, these ambitions, were lost on Emily. She saw them not as individuals, not as children with hopes of their own, but as symbols of everything her father had spoken about. They were merely representatives of the thing that she had been taught to fear and reject. To her, Jamal and Kayla were not real people. They were the other, the ones who had no place in her world. They were in her young mind part of a threat she didn't fully understand, but was told to fear all the same. Emily's life, however, was not one of vibrant social interaction. She had no friends, no close kit group to call her own. She didn't fit in, not in the way most children do. She was a loner by choice, though she wasn't fully aware of the reasons behind it. She spent most of her time on the edges of groups, quietly observing, never participating, always watching. She took in the world around her with the kind of careful calculation that came from years of being taught that people and events were things to be scrutinized. In the silence of her solitude, Emily's mind began to churn, to form thoughts that were shaped by the lessons she had absorbed from her parents. The quiet whispers of hate, of fear, of division began to crystallize into something more tangible. They took root in her heart, blossoming into something far darker. Despite her silence, Emily was never unaware. She saw everything. She watched as Jamal and Kayla laughed together in the hallway, oblivious to the storm that was brewing in her mind. She watched them interact with others, their innocence a stark contrast to the thoughts that twisted inside her. It wasn't just a dislike for them that grew, it was something much more toxic, something much more dangerous. Emily, at 12 years old, began to internalize the ideas that had been passed down to her, ideas that had no place in the world of children, ideas that belonged to a past that was meant to stay buried. She couldn't articulate it, not fully, but she knew one thing with terrifying clarity. They didn't belong. Not here, not in her world. She had never spoken to Jamal or Kayla, not beyond the casual exchanges that were a part of school life. But in her mind, they were always there, always present, a constant reminder of the world she had been taught to reject. Emily never needed a reason for her hatred. It had been instilled in her long before she could fully understand it. It wasn't about race, not in the way most people would describe it. It was about belonging, about who was allowed to exist in the same space as her and who was not. Emily's understanding of the world was simple, black and white, with no room for nuance, no room for the complexities of human nature. She had been taught that some people were different, and that difference was a threat. And in Emily's mind, threats needed to be eliminated. Her thoughts were carefully hidden, like a quiet storm brewing beneath the surface. She didn't speak about them, not to anyone. But every day, as she sat alone, watching her peers interact, the storm grew. And every day, the seeds of hatred her parents had planted in her began to grow into something far more dangerous. Emily wasn't just observing anymore. She was calculating. She was learning. And what she was learning wasn't about love or acceptance or understanding. It was about fear and division and a terrifying kind of hate that would soon find a way to manifest itself in the world. Emily's school days unfolded like the quiet pages of a book no one bothered to read. Her time in class was uneventful, a blur of lessons and passing moments that never seemed to last. She was a solitary figure, not a part of any group, not even a fleeting presence in the back of the classroom. She sat at the edge of things, close enough to be seen, but far enough to remain unnoticed. Her peers would often chat in small groups, laughing and exchanging pleasantries, but Emily remained on the periphery, an observer more than a participant. Her gaze would occasionally drift over to the small group of black students who attended the school, Jamal Reed and Kayla Thompson among them. They were a rare presence, their faces standing out in the sea of white students that populated the school, but Emily never saw them as individuals. Never saw them as anything other than an intrusion into her world. Jamal, with his bright smile and easygoing nature, would sometimes approach her, offering a simple greeting or an invitation to join the others for lunch. He was a boy full of life, his innocence radiating from him in a way that Emily could not comprehend. Kayla, quieter and more reserved, would occasionally offer her notes if Emily had missed something in class. She was thoughtful, her kindness genuine, but Emily felt nothing for it. There was no animosity in her heart toward them. Not yet. Instead, there was a sense of indifference. They were there, occupying space, but to Emily, they didn't belong. She would turn away, dismissing them without a second thought, as though their existence was a mere inconvenience she had learned to tolerate. At home, the lessons of intolerance continued to shape Emily's world. Her father, a man deeply entrenched in his own views of the world, would often speak in terms that carried the weight of generations of prejudice. He would rant about the changing demographics of the country, how things were better in the old days, when our kind held the power. He would mutter racial slurs, making sure that his words were sharp enough to be heard, but veiled in a way that seemed almost casual. Emily's mother, though more reserved, never voiced opposition to her husband's opinions. She didn't need to. The silent nods she gave, the faint gestures that suggested approval, reinforced the worldview Emily was being fed. It was a worldview where some people belonged and others didn't, where race was a marker of who deserved to be a part of society and who was to be excluded. As Emily grew older, the quiet lessons at home began to take root in her heart. The world her parents had created for her was one that revolved around boundaries, around lines that were drawn not with chalk or ink, but with hatred and fear. By the time Emily turned 12, those boundaries had hardened into something far more dangerous than simple ignorance. They had become a toxic, festering belief that the world would be better if it were just as her father described it, uncluttered by those who didn't look like her. The ideologies she had absorbed at home began to seep into her every thought, clouding her judgment and shaping her view of the world in ways she had never questioned. It was late at night when Emily began to seek out more of these ideas, finding a dark corner of the internet where hate was disguised as truth. She stumbled across forums, chat rooms, and social media groups where people like her father ranted about the same things he had taught her. But these weren't just words on a page. They were ideas, affirmations of everything she had been raised to believe. The more she read, the more she found herself becoming consumed by them. Hate was no longer a concept she only heard at home. It was something she could touch, something she could feel. The anonymity of the online world allowed her to embrace these beliefs without fear of judgment, without consequence. She followed groups that glorified violence against minorities, that painted anyone who didn't share her skin color as a threat to everything that mattered. The idea of revenge, something so foreign to her in the past, started to fester. She found herself imagining what it would be like to rid the world of the people who she had been taught to see as invaders. She fantasized about their removal, about how easy it would be to make the world hers again, to make it the way her father always talked about. Jamal and Kayla, once simply classmates, began to take on a much darker significance in Emily's mind. They weren't just students in her school anymore. They had become the embodiment of everything she loathed. Jamal, with his ever-present smile, no longer appeared as a friendly face, but as an enemy, a symbol of what Emily had come to despise. Kayla, too, once a quiet girl who had tried to be kind, now represented something foreign, something alien that didn't belong in the world Emily had been raised to know. In Emily's mind, they were no longer children. They were symbols of a much greater problem. They were the face of the thing her father had been talking about, the thing that had to be removed. The words she read online, the things her father had said, all began to blur together, and Emily's thoughts turned darker. Her fantasies became more vivid, more detailed. She imagined what it would be like to erase them from existence, to make the world right again. Her actions were still unspoken, though. They were ideas, fantasies, thoughts that she kept to herself, hidden in the recesses of her mind. But they were growing stronger, taking shape, and Emily knew that one day, if she didn't act on them, they would consume her entirely. She began to plan, to imagine what it would take to make her thoughts a reality. She knew it wouldn't be easy. There would be consequences, there would be blood, but the power she would feel, the sense of control, would be worth it. Jamal and Kayla were just the beginning, she thought. They were the targets of her rage, but in her mind they symbolized a much larger issue. They were, in her eyes, the first step toward creating a world where people like her were the ones in charge. The transformation inside Emily was subtle but undeniable. It wasn't sudden. It wasn't a dramatic shift in behavior, but more of a quiet erosion of the person she once was. The girl who had once been content to sit quietly at the back of the classroom was now filled with hatred, with rage, and with a desire for something much darker. Jamal and Kayla, once mere faces in a classroom, had become the focal point of her growing anger. It was no longer just about them. It was about what they represented, what they stood for in a world Emily had been taught to fear. And soon that fear would turn into something far more dangerous. A thirst for retribution. In the weeks leading up to the attack, Emily's behavior shifted noticeably. The calm, reserved girl who had once quietly observed her peers now began to show signs of restlessness, a subtle but unsettling tension that seemed to hang over her every move. Her once steady routine became disrupted, as though some dark, uncontrollable force had started to take hold of her mind. She had always been observant, but now her eyes seemed sharper, more focused, as if she were constantly scanning the world around her, looking for the perfect opportunity. It wasn't just that she wanted to do something, it was that she needed to. Emily became fixated on the idea of making a statement, something grand, something that would get the attention she believed it deserved. It wasn't enough to simply hurt people, not in the way one might imagine. No, Emily wanted to send a message, to strike fear into the hearts of those she had been taught to despise. At first, her obsession was quiet, hidden in the depths of her mind. She spent hours at night, alone in her room, her eyes glued to the glowing screen of her computer. She scrolled through hate-filled forums, stories of revenge and retribution that resonated deeply with the twisted sense of righteousness that had slowly grown within her. She read with an intensity that bordered on frenzy, internalizing the words of those who had taken matters into their own hands, just like the fantasies she had nurtured for so long. The more she read, the more it felt like a call to action. Her thoughts became consumed by the idea of revenge. She knew that to do something like this, to carry out the plan that was now taking root in her mind, would change everything. It wasn't just about violence, it was about taking control, about asserting herself in a world that had never truly accepted her. Emily's thoughts, however, were not confined to the digital world. She had a more tangible plan in mind, one that would involve real action. Her father's pistol, an old relic from his youth, became the focal point of her preparations. It was kept locked away in a drawer in his bedroom, hidden from view but easily accessible to someone who knew where to look. Emily had seen it many times before, a piece of her father's history, though she had never paid it much attention. Now, however, it held a different significance. She studied it in secret, waiting for the right moment. She knew that her parents would never notice its disappearance, not when they were distracted with their own lives, lost in their own worlds of obliviousness. They were not concerned with what she was doing. They had never questioned the darkness that was festering inside her. Each night, Emily would sneak into her father's room and take the pistol, quietly slipping it into her bag. She would retreat to the safety of her room, away from the eyes of the world, and practice. The weight of the gun in her hands felt both foreign and familiar, a symbol of power that she had never known. She spent hours learning how to load the weapon, how to aim it, how to make sure that when the moment came, she would not hesitate. It was a delicate balance of fear and excitement. She was terrified of what she was doing, but at the same time there was a strange thrill that came with it. The act of taking the pistol, holding it in her hands, gave her a sense of control, something she had never truly experienced before. She felt empowered, as though the world had finally opened up to her, as though she could shape her fate with her own hands. As Emily practiced, she also began to study the layout of the school, carefully memorizing every detail she could. She knew the hallways like the back of her hand, having walked them day after day for years, but now she studied them with a different purpose in mind. She mapped out the classrooms, the escape routes, the places where she could hide if things went wrong. She knew that the school, with all its pride and attention to tradition, was woefully underprepared for something like what she was planning. There were no security cameras in the hallways. No one would be watching, not until it was too late. She spent hours each day, obsessing over every little detail. When would the attack take place? It had to be at the right time, when the school would be most vulnerable. She knew that the best chance for chaos would come during the afternoon break, when students were allowed to roam freely in the halls. It was during that time that the students would be most scattered, unaware, and vulnerable. It was then that the world would be hers. The more Emily planned, the more she felt a sense of inevitability take over. She had become consumed by the idea it was no longer something she could put off, something she could simply daydream about. The plan had taken root in her mind, and there was no way to stop it. The growing urgency within her made her feel like she was living in a constant state of heightened awareness, her mind always alert, her thoughts swirling with anticipation. She would sit in class, her body still, but her mind racing. The details, the timing, the target, it all consumed her. The fantasy she had once created in her mind now seemed more like a blueprint, one that she would follow to the letter. One evening, after another long day of obsessing over her plan, Emily sat at her computer, scrolling through more online forums. The words she read became more and more real to her, the stories of others who had taken violent action, people who had felt the same way she did. The twisted sense of righteousness she had felt for so long was now a full-blown obsession. There was no turning back now. She could feel it. Her time had come. She could no longer sit on the sidelines of her own life, silently watching as the world continued without her. This was her moment, the moment she had been waiting for. She had to act. She had no choice. With each passing day, Emily's resolve grew stronger. The moment of truth was approaching, and she could feel the weight of it pressing down on her chest. Her plan was nearly complete. The gun was in her hands, the school was mapped out in her mind, and her timing was set. She knew that once she took this step, there would be no going back. But for Emily, that didn't matter anymore. She was no longer the girl who sat quietly in the back of a classroom, ignored and overlooked. She had a purpose now, and it was one that would change everything. The time for planning, for fantasizing, had come to an end. The world would soon know her name, and there would be no escaping the consequences of what she was about to do. The day of the attack began just like any other, quiet and uneventful. Emily woke up earlier than usual, as she had done many times before, but this time there was a different weight to the air. The usual morning routine of her parents preparing for work and her quiet movements through the house felt eerily normal, as though nothing had changed. Her parents, oblivious to the deadly plans that had been carefully set into motion, went about their business with no inkling of what was to come. Emily's mind, however, was elsewhere. It was focused, calculating, precise. Every detail of her plan had been rehearsed in her mind countless times. She had already taken the steps to ensure that there would be no turning back. The night before, she had snuck into her father's bedroom and carefully removed the pistol that was hidden in the drawer. It had taken only a few moments, just enough time for her to silently claim what she needed. The weight of it was heavy in her hands, but it felt right. The cold metal was both foreign and familiar, a tool of power that had become the center of her obsession. She had tucked the gun into her bag, making sure that no one would see it as she made her way out of the house. Her parents were too preoccupied with their routines to notice her quiet departure. Emily slipped out of the house unnoticed, and the finality of it all settled in her chest. Today, everything would change. At school, the day carried on as usual. Students filled the halls, laughing and chatting, their minds occupied with trivialities, tests, assignments, gossip. They moved through their routines like well-rehearsed actors on a stage, unaware that their world was about to be shattered. Emily walked through the halls, unnoticed by most, her presence barely registering with anyone. The world around her felt distant, disconnected from the purpose that had consumed her thoughts for weeks. She passed by Jamal and Kayla as they sat together in the cafeteria, laughing over something insignificant, their innocence radiating in stark contrast to the darkness Emily had come to embrace. She glanced at them, her heart pounding in her chest, but she didn't flinch. There was no hesitation now. The plan was set. She had come too far to back out. Jamal's smile, warm and inviting, seemed to mock her in that moment. Kayla, shy and unassuming, gave no thought to the storm that was building in Emily's mind. They were nothing more than obstacles now, symbols of everything Emily had been taught to hate. Everything she had come to believe needed to be erased. She continued walking, her steps steady and purposeful, though her mind was racing. There was a coldness to her movements, a mechanical precision that would have gone unnoticed by anyone else. But for Emily, this was all part of the plan. The bell rang for the final break of the day, and the hallways erupted with the sound of footsteps as students poured into the corridors, eager for their brief respite. Emily took her position, standing near the entrance to the hall, where she could easily see everyone coming and going. She watched as Jamal and Kayla walked past, their attention absorbed by their conversation. Unaware of the danger lurking just steps away, Emily waited for the perfect moment, the right combination of timing and isolation. As the two students walked deeper into the hallway, their backs to her, Emily moved swiftly. She was ready. Her hands, though trembling slightly, were steady with intent. She pulled the pistol from her bag, the weight of it now a steady, familiar presence in her palm. Without a second thought, she aimed and fired. The sound of the gunshot echoed through the building, loud and sharp, its crack splitting the air like a thunderclap. The shock of the sound sent a wave of panic through the school. Students screamed and scattered, rushing to find safety, but Emily didn't move. She stood there, watching as Jamal crumpled to the floor, his body collapsing in a lifeless heap. The sight of him falling, so still, so final, sent a strange sense of satisfaction through her. This was what she had planned for, what she had trained herself for. This was the moment of power she'd been chasing, and it felt like a rush she could not control. Kayla, seeing Jamal fall, turned and tried to run. She had no chance to escape. Emily fired again, the shot landing with unflinching accuracy. Caleb's body jerked forward, the impact knocking her to the ground. She twitched once before falling still, her life extinguished in an instant. The hallway was filled with chaos now, students shouting, crying, running in all directions, trying to understand what was happening. The sound of their panic was a dull roar in the background of Emily's calm mind. She watched them scatter, their fear palpable, and yet she felt nothing but control. She began to walk down the hallway, her steps measured, deliberate. The gun was still in her hand, the weight of it now more symbolic than ever. The power was hers. She passed students who were frozen in fear, too shocked to move, too afraid to act. She walked with a purpose, knowing exactly where she was going, knowing exactly what she had to do. Her face was impassive, her gaze distant, as if she were a spectator in her own life, watching the events unfold as though they were not her own actions. As she moved through the hallway, a teacher, having heard the shots, rushed in to intervene. The teacher was a familiar face, someone who had likely seen Emily before in the halls, someone who had no idea of the darkness that had been festering inside her for so long. The teacher shouted at her to stop, but Emily didn't hesitate. She was done. She had done what she had come to do. Without any resistance, she dropped the gun to the ground, the clatter of metal against tile filling the air. She stood still, her face unreadable. The teacher approached her cautiously, unsure of what to do next. Emily didn't react. She simply stared, her emotions blank, the adrenaline still coursing through her veins. It was over. The words she spoke next were cold, detached, and matter-of-fact. They deserved it. There was no remorse in her voice, no sign of regret. For Emily, it was done. The world she had been taught to fear had been erased. And with that, she was no longer just the quiet girl in the back of the classroom. She had become something far darker, something that would be remembered for generations. The news of the shooting spread like wildfire, reaching every corner of the small town within hours. The shock was palpable, suffocating, and even those who had never been directly involved in the tragedy found themselves unable to escape the weight of the horror that had unfolded. What had once been a peaceful community where everyone knew one another and life proceeded in a slow, rhythmic pattern was suddenly thrown into chaos. The idyllic image of the town was shattered, leaving behind a wake of disbelief and confusion. This was not the kind of place where tragedies like this were supposed to happen. People had never thought that something so monstrous could occur in their midst, and yet, there it was, staring them in the face. The local police responded with urgency, their sirens wailing as they rushed to the school, but the damage was already done. Jamal Reed and Kayla Thompson were dead, their lives taken in an instant by a senseless act of violence. Many others had been left traumatized, some physically wounded, others mentally scarred. The grief of the victims' families, the anguish of classmates who had witnessed the attack, and the sheer confusion of everyone involved were overwhelming. The school, which had once been a place of learning and growth, had now become a crime scene, forever tainted by the violence that had erupted within its walls. The town's collective heart seemed to stop, as though the very core of its existence had been ripped away. As news outlets began to pick up the story, the media frenzy that followed was relentless. Every detail of the attack was dissected and broadcasted across national platforms. The press hounded the families, the teachers, and anyone who might have had any connection to Emily Carter or the victims. What motivated such a horrific act? How could someone so young, only 12 years old, carry out such a brutal, calculated attack? The questions were endless, and the media's desire for answers was insatiable. As the hours turned into days, the story dominated headlines. News anchors, journalists, and reporters clung to every shred of information they could find, amplifying the tragedy to a level that seemed almost surreal. Civil rights groups quickly rallied around the families of the victims, their voices loud and clear as they demanded justice. They called for a deeper investigation into the root causes of Emily's actions, particularly focusing on the role that racism had played in shaping her mindset. The online hate groups she had frequented, the ideology she had absorbed, and the subtle yet pervasive teachings of racial intolerance that had been passed down to her were all part of the conversation. The question that loomed over everything was how a young girl, still a child, could come to believe that such violence was justified. The media's coverage also sparked national debates on a number of critical issues. Gun control, school security, and the dangers of radicalizing youth were all hot-butter topics that were discussed with fervor. Every platform, from social media to cable news, became a battleground for opinions. Some argued for stricter gun laws, pointing out that a weapon like Emily's father's pistol should never have been within reach of someone so young. He called for better security measures in schools, highlighting how easily the attack had unfolded in a place that was supposed to be safe. Yet, amidst all the discussions about guns and safety, another unsettling realization began to take shape. Emily, at just 12 years old, had become the face of a new generation of hate. A generation fueled by online ideologies and radical beliefs. The chilling thought that a child whose mind was still in its formative stages could be so deeply influenced by hateful rhetoric was both troubling and terrifying. The internet had become a breeding ground for extremism, where young minds were easily manipulated and radicalized. Emily's actions were a stark reminder of the dangers that lurked in the digital world, where hate was nurtured in the darkest corners of the web and reinforced by communities that thrived on division. She had been just a child when she started immersing herself in these toxic ideas, and yet they had consumed her entirely. The idea that a 12-year-old could be so fully indoctrinated into such hate was a terrifying prospect for the future of society. As the investigation into Emily's background continued, her parents became the center of public outrage. They were forced to go into hiding, their names now synonymous with disgrace and shame. The town, which had once held their family in high regard, now viewed them with suspicion and contempt. No one wanted to hear from them. No one wanted to listen to their excuses. The realization that the values they had instilled in Emily, the very beliefs that had led her to commit such a horrific act, had destroyed so many lives was too much to bear. Emily's father, once a respected figure in the community, was now seen as a man who had failed his daughter and the town. His silence, his refusal to take responsibility, only deepened the wound. Emily's mother, who had always been a passive participant in the upbringing of their daughter, was equally shunned. The shame that now hung over the Carter family was overwhelming, and they disappeared from the public eye, retreating into the shadows of their once privileged life. Their involvement in the tragedy, however indirect, could not be ignored. The town's reputation, once pristine, was now forever tarnished by the actions of their child. No amount of apologies, no amount of justification could erase the damage that had been done. The image of Emily, the quiet girl who had been turned into a symbol of hate, had changed everything. In the weeks and months that followed, the small town would never be the same. The community, forever marked by the tragedy, struggled to rebuild. The wounds ran deep, not just for the families of the victims, but for everyone who had been touched by the events of that day. Jamal and Kayla would never be forgotten, their names etched in the minds of those who had known them. But the question that lingered, unanswered, was how a child could be so deeply affected by the hatred of others. What could have been done to prevent it? And how could the town, the country, and the world move forward in the aftermath of such a devastating loss? The legacy of that tragic day would remain, not just as a reminder of the loss of innocence, but also as a warning of the dangers of allowing hate to fester unchecked. It was a cautionary tale, one that no one wanted to hear, but that everyone needed to listen to. Emily's story, her descent into violence, was not just a personal tragedy, it was a societal one, a reflection of the broken world that allowed such ideologies to thrive. The echoes of that day would reverberate for years to come, reminding everyone of the importance of vigilance, compassion, and the need to combat hatred before it could take root in young minds. The legal system struggled with how to handle Emily's case from the moment the tragedy unfolded. At just 12 years old, Emily was too young to face the full consequences of her actions under Texas law. Legally, she was still a child, and Texas law made provisions for juvenile offenders. But what had happened that afternoon at the school was so horrific that no one could simply ignore the gravity of it. 2 young lives had been taken, lives that had held so much potential. The town had been shattered, and the ripple effects of the violence were felt far beyond the local community. Emily's age alone was no protection against the horror of what she had done. As the details of the attack came to light, it became clear that Emily had not acted out of mere impulsiveness or childish naivety. She had executed her plans with shocking precision. Prosecutors, in their pursuit of justice for the victims, quickly pushed for Emily to be tried as an adult. They argued that the cold, calculated nature of her actions demanded a harsh response. It was hard to fathom that a 12-year-old, with such a clear understanding of her actions and the consequences, could escape the full extent of the law. The fact that she had planned the attack for weeks, carefully studying her school and rehearsing the use of the weapon, painted a picture of a girl far beyond her years in terms of malice. She had methodically prepared, planned, and executed her attack with chilling precision. And this, the prosecution contended, was not the behavior of an innocent child, but of someone who should be held accountable for her crime. The defense, on the other hand, fought to protect Emily's rights as a child, arguing that at 12 she lacked the maturity and understanding to fully comprehend the consequences of her actions. Her upbringing, they argued, played a central role in shaping her worldview. The defense pointed to Emily's home environment, the toxic beliefs instilled in her by her father, and the influence of hate-filled online communities that had radicalized her. They painted a picture of a girl who was a product of her circumstances, a young mind twisted by external factors beyond her control. Emily, they argued, was still a child, heavily influenced by the adults around her, and the burden of responsibility for her actions rested squarely on the shoulders of her parents and the community that had allowed such hatred to fester. The trial itself was a long and contentious affair. It was a spectacle that drew national attention, and every moment seemed to echo the tragedy of that fateful day. The families of the victims, who had already endured unimaginable pain, were forced to relive the horror again and again. The courtroom was filled with emotion as the details of the attack were laid bare, and the full scale of the devastation became apparent. For the victims' families, the trial was another chapter in their nightmare. A painful reminder that their loved ones were gone, victims of a senseless act of violence that no one could have predicted. Emily's defense team tried their best to sway the court's opinion, but the evidence was overwhelming. They argued that her parents were responsible for the twisted ideology that had shaped her, but it was difficult for anyone to ignore the cold reality of what Emily had done. She had not simply acted in a moment of impulsive rage. She had thought about it, planned it, and carried it out with chilling precision. There was no question that Emily was deeply troubled, but the fact remained that she had taken lives that could never be returned. In the end, the court ruled that Emily would be tried as an adult, a decision that sent shockwaves through the nation. Her youth did not absolve her of the consequences of her actions, and the severity of the crime outweighed her age. The sentence was life in prison without the possibility of parole. It was a decision that sparked heated debate across the country. Some believed that justice had been served, that Emily's actions had been so heinous that she deserved to spend the rest of her life behind bars. Others questioned whether a 12-year-old could truly understand the weight of her actions, and whether a life sentence was too harsh for someone so young, who had been so heavily influenced by the world around her. As the years passed, the story of Emily Carter gradually faded into the background. The media moved on, and the town, though forever scarred by the events, began to rebuild. The community struggled to move past the tragedy, but the questions about Emily's upbringing and the role that her parents had played in shaping her worldview lingered. Was she a victim of circumstance, a girl who had been shaped by hatred and ignorance, or was she a monster capable of the most horrific acts of violence? It was a question that no one could truly answer. Emily's name became a symbol of something darker, something more sinister. She had become a face for a generation of children who had been radicalized by the internet, by hate-filled ideologies that found fertile ground in the minds of young, impressionable people. Her story was a cautionary tale, a reminder of the dangers of letting hatred fester unchecked. It was a reminder that even the most innocent of minds could be twisted into something unrecognizable if they were exposed to the wrong ideas at the wrong time. The tragedy in Texas was not just a story about a child who killed. It was a story about how the seeds of hatred could grow in the most innocent of minds and the devastating consequences that could result when they were allowed to fester unchecked. Emily's story was not just about her, but about a broken system, a broken society, and the broken world in which she had been raised. It was a stark reminder that hatred, when allowed to grow unchecked, can take root in the most unexpected places, and the consequences of that hatred can be far-reaching and devastating.